Okay, I'm not going to repeat myself. So, okay. Anyway, so I'm here now, and I'm basically available for lectures, but also just for questions on the commission, on working there, on any questions you might have on that topic. For the lecture today, and not really knowing your backgrounds, I choose a topic which is fairly broad. It's really on comparability of data. It's the basic job we do at Eurostat, because I mean, you could ask, why should there be a statistical office at the Commission at all? I mean, all the countries produce their own data. You just put them together. Do you really need 800 people to do that? And well, I say, of course, yes, you do need them. But basically, what is extremely important is that we can provide the EU with comparable data. And if I say comparable, I mean over countries, between countries, but also over time. So if we want to know if a new country can join the monetary union, can start using the euro, we need to look at the debt of that country. And we have to be sure that future pensions are perfectly calculated into the debt as it is done for all other countries. And or GDP is calculated exactly the same way, and so forth. So it's extremely important to be sure that countries do the same thing. We write regulations to do that in discussion with the countries. And then we watch over the comparability over time, how we collect this data each year or each quarter, depending on the data collection, to make sure we have the same set of data of all countries covering all topics. Now, of course, the most important statistics are the hard economic ones. So the one relevant for the euro, the debt, the deficit, inflation. But we also collect a lot of data on which we call social statistics, basically on the labor market, on population, on demographics, on income, on inequality, even though the EU has quite a lot of limits on what they can do there. The EU is a supranational organization. I mean, I'm sure you all know more than I do about how it all works, because I just know the statistical side of it. And the countries have not given up their these sides to the EU yet. So all the labor market policy, for example, is still made in the countries. The Commission only gives advice, they do analysis, and we monitor the data. We have a lot of scoreboards where we compare countries and their progress in convergence and how well they're doing. So that's a bit the background. During the COVID crisis now, we in the labor market statistics had a lot of stress, a lot of work, because for the first time we had the labor market being hit first, basically. Usually we're a lagging indicator, or the unemployment rate, employment rate, and so forth. Everything concerning the labor market is lagging. So first you have the economic shock, and then afterwards you see, okay, unemployment starts rising and so forth. This time it was all of a sudden in March, in many countries, not all of them at the same time, that people could not go to work anymore. It just stopped. So the labor market was immediately in the spotlight, and we had to immediately react and make, first of all, sure our data was being collected, which was not obvious. And unfortunately, some countries had more problems than others. So there was a big spotlight on us. And quite a lot of stories were written on the labor market. Then in the summer, these are just random articles from summer 2020. And yeah, I didn't fully put the sources in, which is very bad style, and you shouldn't do that. It's just examples. And if you look at this, I mean, these headlines or stories make sense. You probably saw graphs looking a bit like this, where you see well, I hope you do see this somewhat darker line here is the European Union. This one is the USA. We're looking at the monthly unemployment rate. And you see in April 2020, a huge spike in the US. Usually and visibly, the EU is much worse off concerning unemployment. Unemployment is a huge problem in the EU. Youth unemployment, long-term unemployment rates are, these are topics we are concerned with quite a bit. And historically, it has always been the case that the US is doing much better in terms of this indicator. And now what I want to talk to you a bit more about is why this is the picture we get and whether this really tells the whole story. Are these data points really comparable? Now, to collect unemployment data, you basically need to know the number of unemployed and the number of employed. That's basically it. It's a classic. I'm just putting it to refresh the memory. To do this in a comparable way in the EU, we follow the ILO, the International Labour Organization's definitions or recommendations. They are quite vague as statistics go, because they're for the whole world, basically. And if you want to measure unemployment in sub-Saharan Africa or in Europe, it's a different story. So you want to keep them somewhat vague, and then depending on the region of the world, you implement them in some way. But the recommendation is to collect employment for all persons of working age who during a specific period, which is your reference period, we look at weeks, have worked even for, and this is again, you defined differently, for 1 hour per week, for example, or 15 hours per week. And you have, these people should have received either a wage or a profit, or should have profited from their work in some other way, as for example, farmers being able to eat their fruit afterwards. And then the unemployment definitions, these are all the people who are out of work, depending, based on the employment definition before, who are actively looking for work and who are available for work. So that's the basic definition. And the important part is that you don't go to people and you ask them, so what are you? They will tell you, I'm a student, I'm retired. Some will say I'm unemployed. But instead you go and you ask them, did you do any work at all, even for 1 hour in the week of, I don't know, 1st of August to 7th of August? If you didn't do that, were you actively looking for work? These are your working methods. Were you available to start working in this on this week? So you have to be very, very specific in order to later on collect the data to really compare. And so in the EU, we have implemented this recommendation, and you will notice that for the employed, it has become a lot longer. So we include those who have worked for at least 1 hour for pay or profit or family gain, which means if you work in your parents' enterprise, that would count as employed. And it also includes people who were not at work during the reference week, but had a job or business, and they still had a connection to it. And for unemployment, this is basically a repetition of the recommendation, just with a bit more specificity. So we don't ask people above the age of 74 in Europe. We assume they are out of the labor force unless they indicate they are employed. And we really ask about the reference week and the 2 weeks following the reference week for the availability. All right, and now for the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US, they also follow the ILO recommendations. Now I found a very nice graph of what they do. And I wonder if you see somewhere a relevant deviation from the EU definition. It's a bit mean if you're not used to look at these sort of graphs, but yeah. Yes, it's true. I didn't discuss this. It's basically if you are neither employed nor unemployed, then you're just out of the labor force. We used to call it inactive, which is not a very nice term, because if you're a full-time student, I'm sure you're not inactive. So it just means you're not working and you're not looking for work. So yeah, I didn't discuss this. So a little hidden, we said we have those who are absent from the job, who are on vacation or ill. We didn't specify it for the EU. But here we have one point, which I didn't mention. It's people on layoff awaiting recall. Now, this is also an absence from work. It means you still have a connection to your job because you're waiting for recall. In the US, it's directly counted as unemployed. You see here the connection. So there is no testing if people are actively looking or are available for work. If you're on temporary layoff, you're immediately counted as unemployed. In the EU definition, we just have the block of absences. We test for connection to your work, which means in this specific case, we had a lot of questions from countries who said, we now have all of a sudden people on layoff, they're barred from work, they still get a salary, but they don't know when they can come back. And then we have these government schemes. So the government is giving money to the firm to pay the salary. It's not the full salary. How do we count them? And luckily for that, we have our regulation. It was very clear. If you receive at least half of your salary via your employer, no matter where the employer gets the money from, or you have an agreed upon date to come back to work, you're still counted as employed. If not, if you don't have either of this condition, then we look, have you been actively looking for a different job? And have you been available to do that job? If yes, then you count as unemployed. And only if you don't look or you're not available, then you're out of the labor force and neither employed nor unemployed. Now, clearly, we've had this always. This is not something the BLS or Eurostat just came up with. These were definitions that have always been used. So the data has always been correctly calculated over time. Sorry, I really get out of breath with the mask on. What I want to look at now is what could this mean for the data, for this graph we saw in the beginning, for the skyrocketing unemployment in the US, while the EU looked pretty good for once on the labor market. And what we did is that we calculated some experimental data. We have a quarterly survey, so we're usually not looking at weekly data. But for the EU, we could really take apart. We looked at when was the interview taken, and we took week by week the absences from work. And you see on this yellow line, I'm sorry, it's really hard to see now, but the yellow line shows you the average between 2015 and 2019 for each calendar week. So you see here, this is the week after Christmas, basically. Our weeks always start on the first Thursday of the year. And a lot of people are usually here still on vacation, and then they come back to work and they work a lot. Sometimes they're off here in the spring for Easter, but since Easter shifts a bit, it's not really visible. And then we take a lot of vacation in the EU. We have a big jump here around end of July, beginning August. It's when everyone goes on vacation. Then it goes down again, and only at the end of the year, the Christmas week, people take another week of vacation, and you see the absence from work being really determined by the vacation times. You don't really see another effect. Then the blue line is the 2021, where you see that in calendar week 11, it starts suddenly to rise, completely different pattern. It's of course the COVID restrictions coming in. And then only towards the summer, we had a pretty normal summer, 2020. I think here it was similar. And then it followed again, almost the same pattern, didn't quite go back in November. And then in December, it went really high because people hadn't actually taken their vacation days. So they were doing that over the winter, over the Christmas period. So clearly we should, if we would treat these absences from work in the same way, we probably should have seen a similar pattern. we can look at this data also a little bit more in terms of reason for absence. And this is just illustration because we all know the reason for absence. But you see that usually, yes, the holidays are the ones determining the whole pattern because they're the highest. You don't see this seasonal variation. It's seasonally adjusted data. It just gives you the, let's say, average level over the year. And then the second reason was always illness or disability, temporary disability. Other comprises all kinds of reasons why you might not be at work. Bad weather or for people who work outside. And then the temporary layoff, which is the dark blue, and you see it that it never mattered. We have a tiny, tiny peak after the crisis, 2008, 2009. And that was basically it. If you look at this the data for the whole of the EU, it's nothing. And then we have this huge peak now, really almost 13 millions at the highest point. So luckily the BLS splits up their unemployment data very nicely, and they show you exactly where someone is or why someone is unemployed. So they tell you by age, by sex, by reason or duration of unemployment. And they also tell you exactly who are these temporary layoffs. And so I took this data, subtracted it, and I did not adapt the employment level. I just left it as before. Usually I should have added some of them back, but I figured this was enough of an illustration. So if you do that, this is the line I showed you before, this light blue, and the greenish line below is the one you get if you remove those temporary layoffs from the unemployment data. And you see that all of a sudden the pattern looks exactly as the one from the EU. It's perfectly parallel, no differences. Yes. That's the EU again. It's just the old picture with the new or made up US rate added. Yeah. And it just shows you really that this tiny difference in the definition, which never mattered, all of a sudden is really visible and really sort of important. And it was noticed, as you saw, by all these stories in the beginning. Well, just since I talk about these news stories. So I only showed you some headlines, and basically all these stories go to explain that in the EU, there was a massive response of governments giving money to firms to keep people employed, even if they were unable to go to work, while in the US, people were more likely to be fired. Overall, it's very difficult because, of course, we have published our figures, the US have published their figures, and none of these journalists have really made a mistake or something. They have just sort of the missing background that I show you here. And in terms of the welfare of what happened to people who had to wait for unemployment benefits coming in, who maybe did not know if they would get anything. I think the journalists got it right. They basically agreed that the European one was a bit easier on the workers. It might be worse for the economy in the long term, to be seen, but it was easier for the people who just continued getting a salary, even if it was lower, just because of the security it gave. So it's not that they got it completely wrong in terms of the analysis following, but it's just the let's say the headlines on talking about the unemployment is a bit difficult, because of course these concepts should be fully comparable, even if the, let's say, the welfare analysis you do afterwards might be different. It's just two different things, the definition and the, let's say, the meaning of what unemployment means in the two areas. All right, so and I would like to show another small aspect of this whole story, because even looking at the data like this, it's quite a small rise. I mean, if you think about how strongly the labor market was impacted, it was the expectations from our analysts in the commission was that it should rise. And they kept asking us, do you have a problem with collecting the data? Because we don't see that rise. What is happening? Are people not answering your survey? Because it's based on a sample survey. And of course, it was really complicated. We had to usually part of it is done in person. So this had to be switched to doing it by phone or online, which means you have to have the phone numbers, which you're not supposed to have because of data protection and so forth. So they thought it might be that, but for two countries who did a really good job collecting data and who generally have very high quality data with very big samples, we could tell that this was not what was happening. So if you look at the monthly unemployment rate, it's a particularly strong effect for Italy, which was also really hit hardest in the EU, specifically in the first wave. You see that in March and April, unemployment really plummeted. It was as low as it has ever been. Sounds like a real success story of government subvention, subsidies. But this is not the case. We see in France with a little delay a bit the same effect, that initially unemployment really went down, which Brussels did not like. So we had to look at different indicators to explain this a bit better. So the first thing is, of course, you look at the employment rate. Did employment go up for some strange reason? Did some new measures create a lot more jobs? But no, we did see between the Q1 2020 and Q2 2020, it's hard to read, sorry about that, it's very small, that employment went markedly down. Now, this doesn't look like much, but in terms of the time series, the whole time series, a drop in one quarter for almost 2%, that's massive. It's a really large drop. So this wasn't it. And so what did happen, and this is just a different view on the two figures I just showed. We did not see a move from unemployment into employment. These are transitions that you look at, how do people move from one quarter to the next. And we saw that from the first quarter 2020, again here, to the second quarter 2020, there was an absolute minimum movement in unemployment to employment, lowest ever since we started recording these transitions. At the same time, however, we did see that the transition from unemployment into inactivity, so out of the labor force, was at a massive, very high level. So in Italy, where we had this very low unemployment rate, what had happened is that people had stopped looking for work and they had indicated that they were not available for work. Whether this is because they had to take care of children who were kicked out of school, schools were closed, or because they felt that they were inside in their apartments, they were not allowed to leave, so they were not available to work. This we cannot fully know. It's probably a mix of both. So what you see here in Italy and also in France, but Italy is quite a massive amount, that more than half, so we have 50% here, so almost 60% of all unemployed dropped out of the labor force altogether. So while it looks nice to show that unemployment just went up a little in the whole EU, what we see behind is that in some countries, people just dropped out of the labor force completely. So actually, it's a really negative development. This is the same picture for the transition between employment and inactivity. And again, for Italy, more visible than for France, that a large amount of people who left employment did not move towards unemployment, but left completely the labor force. So this was just a small example to illustrate a bit the importance of data comparability. Of course, with the US, we don't sit down and discuss our definitions to make sure they're fully harmonized. It's not their job, it's not our job. But people do. They take the data, they say, you know, it's unemployment, sure, why not? Should be comparable, should be the same. And they compare it, and this is one case where this went sort of wrong and where it might not actually mean what you think it means. And it led to a lot of very positive stories about the EU labor market, which are not, I mean, if you really look and go into detail, it's not as positive, unfortunately, as it seemed at the time, especially. So this was a first example, which was really COVID related now. I don't know if there are any questions on this particularly. Yes.
I was wondering whether you have data for these statistics on employment or unemployment that are broken down by gender. Because I was looking at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of articles about the US that I read where in a family unit where one person had to drop out of the labor force, it was usually the woman to take care of kids or something. So I read a lot of US statistics about that. So I didn't know if there was a similar trend.
Yeah, we do have, we are obliged to provide all data where we possibly can, broken down by gender. I don't have them right here. I can, of course, give you the links or point you towards them. And in fact, this is a really interesting question because this is what we expected. We also had all the articles that this was a crisis which really hit women harder because they had the double work in many cases of staying at home, taking care of the kids, trying to work at the same time somehow. Or they were the ones in what we called in Europe the relevant occupations, so working in grocery stores or as a nurse who still had to go to work but didn't have childcare. So, but when we actually collected our data and we looked at the total amount of hours worked, which, you know, you see a downward spike like this, and the absences from work and all these data, on average, we could not find a stronger effect for women than for men. But again, we should not confuse the fact that these data do not show a different effect with how welfare developed. So for that, once we have collected income statistics, for example, things like that, which always takes a bit longer because they're backward looking, you always ask about the income of last year, then we can say a bit more. So far for Europe, in most countries, we did not see that effect. Could also be because we have a lot of countries with very low female employment rates. So yeah, but yeah, we didn't see it yet. Yeah. Oh, okay, sorry. How do I have to do something? With the, no? I think it's fine. Okay, you can go ahead, please. I'm not sure it's a acoustic issue.
Are you talking to me?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I never knew that was directed at me.
Sorry.
Yes, I'd like to know how you count parental leave with regard to both employment and unemployment. So if a person is on parental leave, are they counted as employed or unemployed? And then what? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, so for parental leave, it's an interesting question because we have such different rules in the EU on parental leave. So the rule we made now is that if the total expected duration of parental leave exceeds 3 months, it is to be counted as out of the labor force. If it's 3 months or up until 3 months and paid, which is always the case, then it counts as employed. And this does not reflect the actual situation in the countries, obviously, because we have countries who pay you for a whole year at, I don't know, 80% or with a lump sum. But this is to ensure that we count the absences in a comparable way. So, yeah.
Well, I have another question. The OECD, you may not be able to answer this because it's not Eurostat. The OECD publishes a series which they refer to as harmonized unemployment rate.
Yes.
Do you have any idea how they do that?
Yes, we send them the EU data.
Mhm.
It's they get a special extraction from Eurostat, and it's called harmonized because it's all based on the ILO definition. So the BLS data you saw is the one being used in that collection, and the data from the EU is the one in this collection. The reason it's called harmonized is because we have a lot of countries, for example, Germany, but also some other Nordic countries, who nationally don't use this data. They prefer to use administrative data, so they have their own national database, and this is where they count not who is actively searching by asking them, but by seeing who is inscribed for benefits. And this is their national number. And because national rules are so different, this is not something we can use or we collect. This is really a national issue. And the OECD, in order to sort of indicate that what they have is not this national data, they call it harmonized.
Okay.
And it all follows the ILO recommendation.
All right. One other question. Don't now to my mind. I'll come back with you later.
All right, okay, thank you. Okay, then this I'm not used yet to the hybrid form. Sorry. Yes, there's the question.
Yeah, I thought of it. What about for students who are looking for a job?
So the let's say self-perceived or professional status, which could be pensioner or full-time student or whatnot, has nothing to do with whether someone is in a certain labor force situation. So we keep that question actually to last. We don't ask them first, are you a student? Because then they will not answer correctly to whether they're looking for a job or not. We first ask about the job search behavior, about being employed, about being available. And this is independent. So we only care about whether they're a student at a later point, so as not to confuse the two concepts. It's really supposed to be separate. And it's otherwise I could say I'm a student because I'm still studying, but this would not represent really that I'm working full time. So it's a separate issue, yes. So they can be unemployed or employed or out of the labor force.
Thanks.
All right, sure. Yeah.
So I know in the United States, after 2008,
Mhm.
the labor force participation rate dropped by like 2 or 3%. I mean, it's never recovered. Right now, it's I think 4% less than it was in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a similar trend in Europe, and do you see that being something that continues after COVID, seeing a similar effect?
Okay. We did not see the same trend. We have an increasing participation rate of women in the labor force, coming from a low level, certainly in many countries. On whether now this has really hit participation, I could not tell you, honestly, because it's so far we don't see it really. So we had this dip as I showed, that people really moved out of the labor force, but it has recovered so far. I don't see a real reason in Europe, to be honest. I don't know what the reason is in the US that people drop out of the labor force completely, because I would say the pressure to work, even if it's a low paid job, is higher here. But no, I couldn't say that we observed that. Usually what the fear is that we have an increase in long-term unemployment, which is a much bigger issue in Europe. So it's people who keep really working for, who keep looking for jobs, and they're just so underqualified usually, or have such other issues that they just cannot find a job, even though they really actively look. So this is more the fear that once people who are in danger of this in industries which are already on their way out. If they lose their jobs now in this crisis, they will just never find one again. So this is more what we're looking at, and the problems of young people entering the labor market, because we have such high worker protection in many countries that the issue is not so much, or if you have a job, it's nice because it's secure, it's well paid, but if you don't have one and you enter the labor market for the first time, you don't have the experience, it can get quite hard to find a job. So this transition from education to the labor market, there is the worry that this will become even harder, possibly. But so far, it's just not, we're just not there yet. We don't see this yet in any detail. So we saw that the number of young people not in education and not in employment, that rose very strongly the first quarter after the lockdowns, but then it dropped again. So so far the level of these haven't changed yet. So. Right. Okay. What I did add, sorry, I also don't have any clue how late it is, but if we have a bit more time. Yeah, great. I've prepared another example. I read some of your research interests in this note you gave me, Sarah. Thank you for that. And I saw that a lot of you are interested in working on or differences or inequalities and in different versions of that. And we have at Eurostat always a very big problem of showing data on inequalities in a neutral fashion and in a meaningful way. So what I thought might be interesting is to explain a bit this let's say problem using the gender pay gap, which is the difference in gross hourly earnings between men and women as a percentage of the men's earnings. And it's high, it's problematic. I know you cannot properly read it. So what you see here is the EU 27 average. It's almost up to 15%, which means that men earn per hour 15% more than women in the EU on average overall for all men and women in the labor market, all of them working. The highest rate we observe are above 20% in Estonia and Latvia. And the very low ones we find in Luxembourg, where it's almost nil, Romania, and even in Italy, where it's not even 5%. So this is one of the data of the indicators we produce for the policy DGs in Brussels. And it's one we always fight about, because it's very hard to say what this means. It means, though, for all of the people working on average per hour, this is the difference between men and women. Is it all discrimination? Probably not. We know that a lot of women work part-time in Europe, so a part-time job may not pay you as well, just because it's more expensive for the employer, because you get the same social security, you get the same insurances and so forth. This may be one reason. Then we know that women and men in Europe work in different industries. They may have different education. They may have different years of experience, because women are more likely to stay at home with young children. All of these are factors which can explain this gap, and we don't know. Well, so the first thing we should do is to look at the differences by all these characteristics. If you did some econometrics at some point, this is basically just a Mincer wage equation, bit adapted, so you can estimate which share of which characteristic is explained how. Yes, sorry.
I'm just wondering if you have any labor data for refugees and immigrants.
We do, but it's a completely different topic. So I'm happy to answer and talk a bit more about that maybe after this example, if it's okay. All right. This is the same picture, just reversed from 2014, because the colleagues haven't finished the analysis for the 2018 data yet. Just shows the same thing. Again, Romania, Luxembourg, Italy here with low gaps. And the higher ones, in this case, it's Estonia, Czechia, Germany, and Austria. It's just so you have a comparable data to the adjusted one I show you now. Now, when we say we adjust, it says basically we take into account the age, the education, the job, the experience in that job, the type of contract the person has, the working time, and some enterprise characteristics. And we put it all into our regression. And then we look at what is remaining. And this is what we call the adjusted gender pay gap. And immediately, what you see is that we have some interesting developments. So we saw that before, Romania was one with very, very low levels of gender pay gap, unadjusted. And now, because it's very hard to see, Romania is here. It's almost 20%. So it means once I put in all these factors, the gap actually rises. It means women are probably better educated. That's the thing we usually see. They maybe have the jobs in the better paying industries. So it looks a bit fishy that what we would have expected that it goes down, but it goes up in a lot of countries. So, and you see that in some countries which were quite high, like Germany, it has gone down, in fact. So the effect of adjusting completely changes the picture. If you combine them, you see that if they're ordered by the adjusted gender pay gap, that there are some countries where the differences are huge. So the question is, why does the Commission, so the Commission as in our Brussels DGs, why do they prefer the unadjusted gender pay gap as their main indicator? We could give them the adjusted one and say, but at least we take into account age and so forth. And then they say, and they are of course right, yes, but what does it tell us? It only tells us, let's say, the characteristics of the population. It could still be that there's discrimination in how women choose their education, that they're pushed towards social sciences rather than towards mathematical subjects. It could be that men self-select into high-paying industries. So you have an inter-industry discrimination and so forth. So there, even once you adjust for it, it doesn't tell you much about the discrimination part in this. And then the next factor is, of course, that we have in this list of observed characteristics, we're missing all the ones we don't have in the data set, which are observed, for example, marital status, number of children. We miss the income of the household, which is if I have a very rich wife as a husband, I say, I do a job I really like because I don't have to earn an income. Or if you don't, you have a lot more pressure to work somewhere where you get paid well and so forth. So we are already missing a lot of observed characteristics in this particular data set where we have the detailed income information. In this case, also, for example, the region is missing to some extent. If I work in London, well, no, let's say Amsterdam, because the Brits are out. So if I work in Amsterdam, I will earn more than if I work in Maastricht, for example. So, and then we have all the unobserved characteristics and dynamics. So, and the most important one is if we looked at Italy earlier, that had a relatively high, relatively low unadjusted gender pay gap here. So you see it's quite low. But in Italy, we know that hardly a woman works. They have a really, really low labor market participation rate. And the question is this because if they were to work, would the wage be so miserable that they choose not to? It's just not worth the effort to have someone take care of children and so forth. So we might miss out a complete part of this, let's say, discrimination story just by the fact that we cannot model this properly. There are methods to model this. So if you are into this kind of work, you know the Heckman methods, which have been developed to first model the decision to take part in the labor market, and then you use that estimate to correct your wage estimation. And we tried it, but then they say, sorry, but you now have two models before your data point, and it's all hypotheses about who would earn which wage if they were to participate in the labor market. This cannot be our official statistic. And this is why we still have the unadjusted gender pay gap as the one data point for, let's say, the unfairness in payment in the labor market. Yeah, this is just a same picture in many colors, where you can take a decomposition, just a bit added. I think it's quite interesting because specifically for Romania, Lithuania, Poland, so Eastern Europe, it's negative. And this means that women should actually earn a lot more than men based on their characteristics. So it's actually worse than it looks, much worse than judging by education. This is the green part, education, the occupation, the experience, and what is this funny green, and the enterprise they work in. They should earn massively more than their male counterparts. So yeah, but this is just to illustrate the data I explained before. The problem about finding a nice indicator to illustrate this, which is not model-based, is quite high. So just maybe something which is interesting for you if you are going to work about discrimination or inequalities, that the statistics you may find as main indicators and so forth may not tell the whole story, but if you try to improve it, that these are the kind of problems you can run into. So before I forget, the question on migrants, and we do collect data on migration in Europe in general. It's a very difficult data collection because independent of the labor market, we rely on administrative data. So it's the countries collecting their own data on who enters the country with which status. For the labor market, we rely on our survey, where we also ask about the country of birth of parents, your own country of birth. We ask about how long they've been in the country, and how long, where they have come from to the country. So I may be born in Germany, but I came to the US from Luxembourg. So to capture these dynamics. And the main problem is that we find people too late. So people will immigrate, but then they're usually, especially if they're refugees, they're in communal homes. And this is a household survey. So they will be out of our sampling design of the samples the countries take. They usually sample individual dwellings or individual households, not communal households. And so by the time they get their own place, they may be in the sample. And then they have to be either already proficient in the language of the country, or they have to be lucky and be in Luxembourg, where you can be asked in, I think, 8 countries about your labor market status, because we're all foreigners there. So what we see is that we do capture these people, but only after a few, with a lag of about 1.5 years. So we will not be able to, or with this tool, with a household survey, we cannot fully capture the situation on the labor market of new migrants, new entries into a country. And you have always the risk, of course, that they have already left at that. By the time they would be really in the sample, they have already left and moved on, and you sort of never catch them. You have the streams of migrants meandering through Europe, and you will never know about their labor market status. Having said that, they will probably, they may not answer properly to these questions because they're afraid that if they work and it's not quite legal, that they could get into trouble. So it's at best, what we can capture with the survey is a educated guess, I would say. What works well are the inter-EU movements, because you have to sign up, but that part is easy because we're allowed to move wherever. So you just go and say, okay, I now live here, here's my passport. And they make a copy and that's it. And then you're in the sample immediately. So we can nicely see how many people, I don't know, live in Luxembourg who are not Luxembourgish, and what is their labor market status. This is no problem. So this part is well covered, but the movements outside of the EU, it's much harder. So hope that sort of answers the question. Yeah.
So thank you. This was awesome. And I feel like a lot of times and like you were talking about at the beginning with headlines, like a lot of times I feel like I'm confronted with statistics that are being used as part of an argument for something in a newspaper article or something. And I often feel like it's almost impossible to try to like go in and click on every website, figure out all of the exact factors and subjective decisions that were made in how we're going to categorize things and how we're going to collect this data. And so often we're just left with this sort of decision of looking at a number and having no understanding of where it actually came from and all of the nuances of it. What's your advice for dealing with that in everyday life? Because it's one that we're confronted with all the time, and we're told to trust science, trust numbers. It has this like really, it has a lot of power. Data-driven decision making is like huge, and yet we lose all of this nuance.
Yeah, now I got myself into a pickle showing you this, of course, because what my answer to this is, trust us, trust the BLS. I think, of course, it depends. If you're talking to people and you say, but I read this in the New York Times and this is my reference, or I read it in The Economist, I'm fairly certain it's a better source than saying, but someone forwarded me a WhatsApp from someone and it says. So, I mean, clearly this is common sense. Don't need to tell you that. If you do research, I think all you can do is use sources, official sources. As Eurostat, we have a lot of microdata, we have all the indicators, and do use the metadata options which are offered. It's a pain to read through, but everything is there. So this whole story I told you, you don't have to work at Eurostat for that. The OECD figured it all by themselves. This is not something which is hidden or secret. It's just one click away, really. Obviously, in your daily life, you don't have the time to do this and read through all this. But if you're writing a paper or a thesis, just do that. I mean, it's there. It's especially if it's from us, it's probably written in strange English because we have our own Euro English, but it's there. And try to get into the definitions which are used. So you saw it's very formalized what we do. We really think in terms of the question we ask a person, in which order do we ask? Because we know it makes a difference. We know it makes a difference whether we call them or we talk to them in person. I mean, this is super fieldwork statistics, but it's relevant. So the metadata will be written a little bit in that way, which is maybe awkward in the beginning, but I think it's worth an investment to just go through it. And I know I'm from the US side, I mainly know the BLS. I use the OECD for comparative research or for comparative data, and they all have these little buttons saying metadata, and it's all quite clear. So that's all I can offer. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your research. I'm really interested if there's new law actually in your professional education job. It's one of students say, gender-wise, what is it you think of for your career strategy? What do you think will happen moving forward post-COVID in terms of people making employment decisions? Because, you know, for international, and we saw a study abroad colleagues, and it hasn't impacted us directly, but it did sort of make me think, oh, international ed is not as prepared as I thought. Perhaps I should have an anchor out. Not a possibility. So I'm just wondering, what is it that you all think looking ahead to your own self?
Go live in the woods.
I mean, like, on the positive side, it will give us more flexibility. The option to like work at home more, and like have a better like work-life balance, and like other things that I don't need to be like off for. And like especially when we're talking about like the gender gap, like more responsibility being put on women to like be home. Like I think there might be just more people working from home too, especially when they want to have more time for their kids, but also like for themselves. Yeah.
Just kidding. No, I don't want to walk for that, right? Or
Also seems like a interesting shift, right? So certain folks lost some jobs, but they've also been shifted into other roles or other things that have been stronger. I mean, UNC's commitment to study abroad has not gone away, even if, you know, doing some of their office. It's just been sort of shifted and rethought up and sort of recalculated. And also, you know, we've heard so much about a closer look at salary and benefits, and that a lot of folks are really still struggling to hire, or to rehire, or to fill their gaps. So I think there's also kind of a shift here in terms of priorities of employers, but also of folks like you, right? And trying to figure out what is it that I want, what's important to me, what are my values. And we've all read about the Great Resignation, right? I mean, you know, how many people we've heard of, or you know, we're trying to hire two positions in the center, and so many people are writing, I moved to try to be closer to family. Like, this is just, things are really being affected by lots of that.
Yeah, on that, one thing, like my wife's natural job location is in Washington, D.C., but she's able to, she's been in her bedroom for the past 18 months, and even before that, she was based out of Raleigh. So there's a big disconnect now between where your job is and where you have to be to do it. So, you know, for us specifically, we can do a lot of things we would naturally be doing in DC, or maybe to a lesser extent of the city. We can do them here or somewhere else where the cost of living is cheaper, or the imbalances in pay is maybe a little bit more moderated. And to that, just question, the difference in the gender gap in pay.
Yeah.
Where is the United States in terms of that?
I would not want to answer that before checking out the data and making sure it's a comparable survey, and because income is really tricky. These are before taxes, but income before and after taxes in Europe and before and after taxes in the US are not the same. And then if you look at benefits, again, in Europe, the wage inequality is much lower because of that, because we have high taxes and high benefits. So all these measures are impacted by that, and you have to be quite careful on what you use. So I will refrain from saying something before it's wrong. But yeah, and what you did see is that we have massive differences in Europe as well, that we have a tendency that the poorer countries still have a larger gap, and higher inequality, higher wage inequality in general. So a part of convergence is also that these inequality indicators get smaller over time and closer to the well, not to the average. We really would like all to be in I don't know, Sweden to some extent, but so I would think that in the US it's similar, that in some regions it looks quite different than in others, even though taxation and differences in income are not as high here, of course. So, yeah. But I do have a question for you, and it's really related, linked to what Katie just asked. And we've several times had to get the kids from school because we got a message saying no school bus because we don't have any drivers, which is fine because my husband has nothing to do right now. But if he had, it would really be a problem. I mean, you know, you sort of count on the bus. It seems that these wages are just very, very low, right? Because otherwise, I mean, there still is some unemployment. And as I said, in Europe, and I think it's a known fact that we have higher wages, higher benefits. We do have more unemployment because of it, because it's less efficient. But what do you think about this? Because I can't make up my mind either. For me, it's unfair to those who don't have a job to keep these high wages. On the other hand, if you do have a job and you work 40 hours, it should be enough to live off it. And so how do you see that? Yeah.
I think that the more the world modernizes and globalizes and we move more towards technology and automation, we're going to have to restructure the way that the job market and pay and social security and social nets work, because there will not be enough jobs for everybody to make a living. So I think that there will have to be a shift towards a reorganization of the job market, as it were.
Okay, so you think of a sort of skill-based technological change, which is we all have we got a nice education, so for us it will be easy, while some are basically left behind. And but I was more thinking in terms of the situation now, where you have clearly jobs which are open, but they're just so miserable, people don't want to take them. And yeah,
I was going to say I had a waitressing job before the pandemic, which I was laid off from and then never went back for exactly that reason. I was just like, it's not worth the time. And I think that is maybe the thing that will change first here, is how low the minimum wage is. And even if you're working for tips, there's no guarantee of what you'll make. I think there'll be a lot of pressure to change that kind of thing, because it's so unsustainable, and now jobs are unable to fill roles. So for the first time in a long time, the supply and demand, like there's not enough supply to meet the demand for workers. And I think that might change things in a way we haven't seen before, I hope. Yeah, some of those jobs are miserable.
Yeah.
I think that COVID, at least the people that I know, and even for me, have kind of reimagined what work means. I mean, like a lot of people that are stay-at-home parents or had to be stay-at-home parents with their children, they had to kind of come to grasp with them not getting more money for taking care of their children, but also realizing how big of a burden it is to guide their children through school. And also with and also like work at home. I know, like my dad, his work, he increased the amount of hours he was working because there was a blend between, there was no division between where he worked and where he slept. He could literally walk downstairs if he had a bad night sleeping and start working at 4 a.m., which is not healthy. But I think that it's caused a reimagination of like what the value of time and money is worth. And so like, yeah, you are seeing a lot of people that are in these service industry jobs. I mean, I'm sure half of us have been in the service industry and just been like, never again. Okay. I had a service industry job that I got laid off from in the summer. I mean, in the spring, and I'm not going to go back. I have no desire to, partially because why would I want to work for $2 an hour in tips? But I think it's caused like a reimagination and kind of given people the hope that they can demand more in the way that a lot of the times the system didn't allow for.
Okay, interesting. Oh. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay, so wages have to just adjust to the new situation where you perceive a job differently than before also, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I
Okay.
think that like a lot of times people talk about the job market in terms of supply and demand, and in terms of like, this is the wage that's available. But I think there's been a collective realization that, well, people that are in the labor force also have an ability to dictate what the supply and demand is. It's not just the people that own companies. It's not
Yeah.
just the bosses. It's also, okay, well, I'm not going to work if it's not $15 an hour or whatever
Yeah.
it may be. And if we all don't agree to it, then they just won't find a job and they won't be able to have anybody. Where I think that kind of allow people to view where they are in that supply demand
Mhm.
workforce in a way they haven't necessarily beforehand.
I
Sorry.
think it'd be fun to see the opportunity to be bold, like really for private fans, advertising to you every morning. And I would get away for Monday, having my student grad who works there. And all these tourists kept swarming our outdoor table, like, where'd you get that food? Where'd you get that food? So many of the restaurants were closed and not normally closed at that time, because they don't have the leave. And I was like, oh, well, we should be selling these little basic salads where you get these are hot chickens, like 4 people interrupted our lunch after we got our food. And we're in a major tourist destination in the US. And she was like, yeah, we can do a ham fundraiser, like sell these salads. So I think that's what we'll start to see is that if people, I don't know about in Europe, but here, they'll rise to the occasion and they'll see this on themselves and they'll make those results too.
Okay, yeah.
I also think that, so first of all, Chapel Hill City School District came up with this whole new package about rest. This detailed plan about, I know signing bonuses are also problematic, but all sorts of different kinds of things to benefit and like making it an actual job, making sure that people work 40 hours a week. Because of course the benefits issue, and that's the second piece, also the teachers who do our after school program, they all work part-time. So how can it be your full-time job to take care of all these kids? I mean, how can it be what sustains you if you can't even get benefits, but yet you're working really hard with elementary school children every day after school? So nobody can stick around for those kinds of jobs, and how many times do we get benefits? So I think this discussion about healthcare, I mean, people are losing their jobs in the pandemic in the United States and don't have health. Yeah, this is a really huge problem. So I hope that I will remain optimistic for the rest of my life, but that we will, see a shift towards attitudes. First of all,
Yeah, this is one that puzzles me. I'm sorry, the healthcare issue. Yeah, I know because it's more expensive here as a percentage of GDP. This is, I mean, if it was more efficient, like the labor market, the economist in me would be, not quite as appalled. But since it's so much more expensive for so much less output, this part I just don't get. I had to compare quite a lot of medication before coming here, and the prices here are tenfold because the insurers don't, I don't know, they don't discuss with the firms who provide them, with the pharma industry apparently, while in Europe they have these discussions say, I mean, this is the maximum you can get from us, and then this will be the price. While here, apparently the firms just decide themselves what the price is. So this would be such an easy fix for big parts. So, but don't get me started. As I said, it's yeah, it's a strange one for me. So yeah, but no, it was for the labor market. I've read a lot that there was a perceived unhappiness about the higher unemployment benefits, because people were saying, well, now you see, people are not willing to work anymore because they can live off the unemployment benefits. So why would they go and work for the bad jobs? So I mean, even if that were true, it's a sort of a design flaw in the wage and unemployment levels, of course. But so I was just curious if this is a general feeling that the fact that these jobs are not being filled is because these, let's say, benefits were too high during the pandemic. I'm not saying they were, just to hear what the opinion was. Yeah.
I saw that, like about the unemployment thing. They looked at least, I mean, it got cut off very recently in some of the states, but actually in the states where they cut off unemployment with the idea that that would then stimulate job growth, it actually did the opposite. And actually ended up with a higher unemployment rate.
Oh,
than
interesting.
what they had at that time. So actually the states that have cut it off have ended up with equal or higher unemployment, whereas the states that have kept that unemployment have actually either stayed the same or gone lower.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Another thing that came to my mind, which is not really answering the payment question, but like I do wonder, like with the evolving technology and like mobility solutions, a lot of these jobs that are underpaid right now that people don't take, will they even still exist in the future? I mean, obviously right now we like need more bus drivers in Chapel Hill, but that's not true for all of America. Like obviously for us in Europe it's different, like we'll always need bus drivers. But also like people moving away from the office, like that affects all kinds of jobs, like people cleaning offices, like they won't be needed anymore. So not only will those jobs be underpaid and people won't be able or don't want to take them, but maybe in the future they wouldn't even be able to take them even if they were underpaid, and that wouldn't help the employment rate, if that makes sense. That's just something that I was thinking of. Or like waiters, waitresses, like people do DoorDash, maybe not always and forever, but like the need will decrease, if that makes sense.
Okay, okay. I would think that this is sort of a natural, this is sort of this creative destruction process where you have something happening and it does destroy part of an economy, possibly. I mean, think about coal mining. You're still hanging on in Germany, desperately wanting to dig, I don't know, holes in the ground for strange reasons, but we all know it's a dying profession. Still, miners are being in apprenticeship, so that it doesn't make sense. But at the same time, you have new green energy research, and there will be also more, let's say, mid-skilled or low-skilled jobs in these new technologies. And I think so the important part is on education, that you make people, put them in a position that they can shift away from their dying jobs to new ones. And it's actually a big part of what my research is about in these transitions, is trying to measure whether people who lose their jobs, what are their characteristics, and do they find new ones, and what are these relevant characteristics, as long as they're measurable. I mean, a lot of it is just drive and motivation, of course, that if you want to, you take classes in the evening, which again, we could observe, but, you know, so I think this is a general point in every economic cycle, not just now, which of course it was a very sudden, unexpected, and sort of strange shock to the economy, but the process stays the same. People move out, you have a dip, and then new things arise. And yeah, education is the way to let people participate, for sure. Yeah. Sorry, you also had a comment or question?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say that I think a lot of people also underwent huge lifestyle changes. So basically changed their spending habits completely, changed where they lived, what they were doing, how often they were going out, where they were driving. And now they can do more of those things, but if they've saved a lot of money and were able to stop their second job or their part-time job, I think people are maybe more willing to sustain that change in lifestyle and go back to a job that they really didn't like or didn't feel they were fairly compensated for. And I think that's a big part of why maybe people aren't going back to work as well.
Okay. This part for me as a really newcomer here to the area, the economy and the country, is something I find difficult to judge, because what I would think is that you take a job because you have to, otherwise you don't have an income. So I don't, in Europe, having a second or third job is not, I mean, you have one job, you work 38 or 40 hours, or if you're in France, 35. But that's it. And usually you're supposed to live off it. So the idea that you just stop one because you saved enough is somehow something I still have to wrap my mind around. So I'm curious whether this is really a factor, because it would mean that a lot of working is done just for the sake of working to some point, if you can afford to not do it.
Yeah, so like two things that I feel like have really changed and that like I really hope change people's mindsets and that affects some kind of political change in the future is like the concept of essential workers. That there are people who have to go to their job every day in order for our economy to work, and there are people who don't. And that this concept of essential workers, that those are the people who are getting paid the worst in our economy is just like an absurd concept. And so like I hope that the pandemic gets used as an example of why there are people who are doing these like service industry jobs are actually the most essential. And then also I think that like the other really big change in mindset is just like the fact that suddenly parents were having to take care of their kids at home, and we realized how little we have invested as a country in like social infrastructure. So like care work and taking care of kids and elderly people, and just like how much of an issue it is that we actually just rely on certain people to not work in order to take care of these people, and we just treat that as that just doesn't matter in the labor market.
Sorry.
I think also to Neil's point about how badly essential workers were treated, and now the dip in like employment that we're seeing in this like sustained dip is almost a form of like collective wage bargaining in a way. It's like, you treated us so bad during this time when we were essential. We have some of the lowest paying jobs, the lowest benefits. We're not going to go, but it's essential for us to be working in the economy in these jobs to keep it chugging along. And we don't want to do that anymore. We want to be paid decent wages. We want decent benefits. It's almost, we don't have unions in this country really anymore, but like it's almost a form of collective wage bargaining, a decision amongst lower paid workers that they want more.
Yeah, we actually do have the same discussion on essential workers, because it's the same pattern that it's often women in these jobs, often not as the main wage earner in the household. And that now all the promises on increased wages somehow disappeared again after 1 year. And it's going to be interesting whether there's going to be any sort of real result of these promises. But yeah, it was strange, I agree, to see that there was a complete disconnect from the importance and the payment. So, all right. Yeah, I still hope that in the commission we do get some more rights on messing with countries' health systems and social systems, because right now, I mean, you saw the same here. Here it was the states making their own decisions and still making their own decisions. And we had the same. We had Sweden saying, yeah, no, we're fine, we're good. We just do whatever we have always been doing. And right next door, Denmark shut everything down very, very quickly. And they're out now. But every country just coming up with their own strategies. And then for the first time in my children's life, they were stopped at a border. And if you live in Luxembourg, you cross a lot of borders all the time, because we cannot really move, without crossing a border. So they were saying, what is this? This is ridiculous, come on. And it was scary for a while to have a border check again. And there was a lot of protest also, because, some are really inside a village to some extent. And we also saw even inside countries, so Germany, who was also the country who was that was not able to collect any data, because the Bundesländer couldn't agree on whether they would continue collecting data or not. They were also I think, 16 different decisions on how and whether to close schools or open them, or with mask and without. So, and that's just one country out of 27 not being able to make common decisions. So I hope now that the EU gets more competencies in this area, so that in these cases we can agree, and we have a framework for agreeing on one policy in these situations. We had in Luxembourg, our schools did not close. We had one period in the spring of 20 when they were quickly closed. But the whole last year it was open. Everything else was closed. Restaurants, bars, gyms, nothing. You could do nothing except for shop for groceries and go to school. While in, literally 20 kilometers further to the east, children were not in school for a whole year. And so some of my colleagues I work with, who just lived right across the border because it's cheaper, they had a really, really stressful year. Mine was easy. It just seems so ridiculous that we live right next to each other and it's not possible to just come up with the same good solution. Which, so yeah, I'm also curious to see how this is going to develop here, but as long as there is a two-party system, I think the risk is relatively high. It will stay as it is. So, all right. Okay.
I'm so happy to have you here for the whole year.
Yes, I'm also happy to be here for the whole year. So yes.